What's going on, everybody? I'm Matt Harmon. Welcome to the Yahoo Fantasy Forecast, and it is a hell of a day to talk ball. And join me to do just that is Justin Boone. Boone, what's going on, buddy?
I'm doing well, man. And I feel like the people who are watching, when we first come on here, they often see us laughing. And that's because it's quite a good time before the show, behind the scenes, joking around with the producers and you and I. So it was no different today, right? As we came live, we were laughing pretty hard. So it's a good thing, right? It means we got a great crew here.
We got a great crew here. We got a great audience here. Things are awesome. It's a hell of a day to talk ball. It's been a hell of a season to talk ball, and I'm loving it, man.
Sure.
We're getting to that point of the year where it's going to start to slow down. I say this all the time. Like, we rush to Thanksgiving, and then Thanksgiving to the end of the fantasy season, I feel like, is a slow slog. Probably depends on how successful your teams are. That sort of feeling there. But do you kind of feel the same way, or what's your vibe around this time of year?
Yeah, I mean, other than the fatigue that we always talk about, which no one wants to hear about, but, we put in some long hours, you and I, to make sure that we're covering as much possible content as we can. So other than that, kind of catching up to you when you get to the final phases of the season, it's also really funny because as the year goes along, and we've talked about this too on the show, you start to feel like you have a pretty good handle on things at certain points, right? It's been enough time. There's a big sample size. And then all of a sudden things get surprised again by like Joe Burrow potentially coming back early now, right? Which we didn't expect him for a couple weeks. He might play this week. Some running back changes, some injuries, guys coming back from injury, suspensions that we didn't expect. So now you just have to reassess again and try to figure it out for what's the most important time in the fantasy season, which is the stretch running into the fantasy playoffs. So it's a great time. I think that's probably what has us energized here too, right? Trade deadline this week. I don't know about you, but I've had a ton of trade talks with people this week, which is always fun. And then you're looking ahead and starting to plan for the playoffs and figure out, exactly how you're going to get to the title and win it. So I think that too is probably what's fueling us a little bit here.
Couldn't agree more. And that is a perfect transition into what we're going to be talking about here at the top of the show, because yes, we have all our usual Boone 6-pack of questions, literally no one's games of the week, the hurry up offense. We have all that. But first, we've got some news here. As you mentioned, Boone, for the second day today, Adam Schefter reports that Bengals quarterback Joe Burrow has been taking snaps with Cincinnati's starting offense, preparing him for the possibility that he could play this Sunday against the New England Patriots. Joe Flacco took the QB2 reps this week. So what's your reaction to this news? Do you think we're actually going to get Joe Burrow back in our lives this week?
If Joe Flacco was practicing in full all week and didn't, have any sort of little nagging injury that he had been playing through recently, then I would think like, okay, they're probably just playing games and they're going to give Burrow another week because all the reports were saying he was targeting Thanksgiving. And yet after what we saw today, the fact that Flacco has been dealing with an injury and the fact that Flacco now taking second team reps out there, I think we're going to see Burrow back this week, man. And I've been looking at it like during the day today after this came out. I did not expect to have to figure out where I'd be ranking Joe Burrow this week, but I will probably make this change in my update before the game tonight. And of course, sorry to spoil it for everyone, but everyone who's not watching live right now, we are recording this before the Thursday night contest. So I've been looking at it, and I know Jamar Chase isn't going to be out there. You still have T. Higgins, who is basically a pretty solid number one receiver. Just normally he plays the role of a number two. You look at the Patriots defense, and they've basically been a pass funnel most of this year, right? Their run defense is so strong that teams have actually been able to throw on them pretty well. Justin Fields, we're not going to count him from last week, but prior to that, Baker Mayfield, 273 yards, 3 touchdowns in week 10. Maybe even more telling, Michael Penix Jr., 221 yards and 3 touchdowns in week 9. So you can't tell me that Joe Burrow, even if he's not 100%, can't get out there and have some success here. So I'm looking at him right now just behind the range of guys like Jared Goff, Brock Purdy, Jacoby Brissett. He's going to be somewhere in that mix, which is going to make him like a low-end QB1 and a guy that you could potentially start this week.
I've had Joe Burrow in the IR spot of this playoff, of this office league that we somehow talk about all the time. And I've been feeling like an idiot because I've had so many injuries on this team. And I'm like, am I burning an IR spot just for Joe Burrow to not come back this year, which is kind of the way that I thought this would go. And right now, according to the New York Times playoff simulator, which by the way, I have up all the time this time of year, I'm like always looking at that thing.
Of course.
They have a less than 1% chance to make the playoffs, do the Cincinnati Bengals. So their odds to make it into the dance are very, very long. It does in that way feel a little fruitless that Burrow is coming back, but I totally understand that if he's healthy enough to play, he's going to want to get out there. He's going to want to do this thing. And potentially even save the coaching staff, because I think the staff is probably on the ropes at this point. Now, the Bengals don't usually like to make any changes, and I think given their druthers, they would probably just hang on to Zach Taylor and these guys and run it all back next year, despite what maybe the fans might want to see at this stage. But if there's any pressure there, I think Burrow's going to want to get out there and do it for that. And again, just because if he's healthy enough to play, he's going to want to be out there, period, end of story. So I think he will. I think right now, I feel as if he probably will play. And this matchup, as you mentioned, I would 100% feel better if it was Jamar Chase out there. I do worry a little bit that Chase is kind of the easy button of the offense. You know, they move him around, they get him all those layup targets, and that's obviously not T. Higgins' game. Even if he's going to have a big production type moment here without Jamar Chase, it's not the same type of usage from a wide receiver standpoint. Makes me a little nervous with Burrow back out there. But nevertheless, I think if he's out there, you're probably playing him unless during his absence you landed on a really good replacement option.
And you do wonder, like, will he have to knock the rust off? He's a great quarterback, but, you know, when you're out for an extended stretch like that, will he have a game where maybe it doesn't quite look like the normal Joe Burrow that we're used to? That's definitely possible here, right? The other weird thing, though, is if he is anywhere close to himself, it doesn't change that much for fantasy. That's the thing that maybe you wouldn't expect here, right? Because Flacco has been getting this offense moving and they've been producing for fantasy. So overall, like the changes that we talked about already, moving Chase out of the lineup, having Higgins as the number one, that sort of thing, Yoshivas potentially being somebody you could play. You look at the tight ends a little more, all those things. But in terms of like him coming back, normally when you get a really good quarterback coming back from injury, you'd bump everybody up and you'd be super excited about their increased value. And yet for this one, doesn't really change much, right? Like, and I think the fact that he's probably not quite 100% makes him even closer to what Flacco's been doing recently. So from a fantasy perspective, like I said, depends on the options you have. If you have somebody like Jacoby Brissett, you might feel better this week about having him out there and just letting Burrow come back and seeing how he is in the first game back before you throw him in your lineup, assuming, of course, he plays this week, like we're saying. But overall, not really moving many of the players in this offense, just moving Flacco out and Burrow in the rankings.
The only thing I would note it like maybe as a difference here between Burrow and Flacco is that Burrow was sacked on 12.2% of his dropbacks. Obviously, it's a small sample size. It was a very short amount of time that he was on the field. That's in the range of like Lamar Jackson and Justin Fields this year. Flacco's all the way down at 4.4% sack rate this year. So could a compromised Burrow be a little bit more of a sitting duck in the pocket if he's not moving all that well on that toe injury? I think that's possible, but the Patriots don't necessarily have a pass rush where you're really, really scared of one or two guys absolutely wrecking the game plan, especially with Milton Williams on IR set to miss this game. So I think that might make you feel a little bit better about it. It's the only like hesitation I have about the Bengals offense projecting them with a maybe compromised Burrow out there.
Yeah, I would like to think that, Burrow's not a fool either. He's been standing on the sidelines watching this offense and the way that they've had success and potentially even learning from Flacco, right? Like it's nice to have a real veteran like that and get to see him out there and maybe take some things away from him, including let's get that ball out quick because that offensive line is not giving a ton of protection. And a slightly still injured Joe Burrow might want to get that ball out pretty quick too, so he doesn't end up back on IR. So I think all those things would factor in, but I agree with you that that is one area that we'll have to consider here. But the biggest one is he himself? Is he going to come back, or does he have to knock the rust off for a week here? And then we'll get Chase back next week, and then we'll get going with what we know this offense can be, which is very, very productive for fantasy.
Definitely a surprising bit of news here, but we'll continue to monitor and react to this news. Especially make sure to tune in to Fantasy Football Live on Sunday morning. That's going to be right here on YouTube as well. We will have a ton of updates on that situation as we get to it. Okay, with that, let's dive into Boone's 6-pack of questions for Week 12. All right, Boone, for your first one here, you got a little bit of fear mongering to do. The Ray Garvin special. Here, let's hear it. What's your first question for the week?
And I'll throw out all the necessary caveats along the way here. But the first one is, could Jonathan Taylor disappoint down the stretch? Is it possible? And we've seen some things from him that are incredible this season, right? Like historic type numbers from him. So saying that he's not going to continue to put up historic type numbers, that's not that far of a stretch. But you look at this guy, he's coming off his biggest game of the season, right? 286 yards, 3 touchdowns last time out. Then they have the bye. One of the things I'm looking at, as always here, Harmon, is the schedule coming up, right? They have the Chiefs, the Texans, the Jags, the Seahawks, the 49ers, and the Jags again. 5 of those 6 are top 10 defenses in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs. He has really, if you go back and look at what they've done this year, they've had a couple tough matchups, but overall, he has definitely picked on some weaker opponents. The Steelers, who were the toughest matchup that he's had recently, they're the 7th hardest against fantasy RBs. They held him to 57 scoreless yards. That is more of a human Jonathan Taylor, not the superhero that we've seen in a bunch of these other games where he's putting up 3 touchdowns every week and just single-handedly winning fantasy matchups. So I'm not suggesting that he's going to fail, that you're not going to have him in your lineup. Just I'm not expecting necessarily him to be the RB1 overall rest of season. And I think part of that is his value is still tied to Daniel Jones. And we got maybe more of a glimpse of the old Daniel Jones in the last couple of weeks there before the bye. A bunch more turnovers, 7 turnovers in those last 2 games. That was after he only turned it over 3 times in the first 8 weeks. As you just saw on the screen there, it's still up. Daniel Jones today pops up with a calf injury, limited in practice. That was something that came up after I concocted this whole idea I was going to bring up at the beginning of the show. So that is just an additional note that we saw before we came on here that could factor into things that we're going to have to keep an eye on. But with the schedule getting a little bit tougher, especially with the Chiefs, the Texans, and the Seahawks in 3 of the next 4 here, you just wonder if the Colts offense as a whole could potentially take a bit of a step back, and whether Taylor himself might not be as productive. And it isn't necessarily going to be always like that Steelers outing with 57 scoreless yards, but there might be some more of those games mixed in down the stretch here, right? 3 touchdowns in 5 of his 8 games so far. That's just outrageous production, right? So I'm wondering whether CMC, whether Jahmyr Gibbs, whether we see somebody else maybe get hot in the second half of the season, and we see Jonathan Taylor just take a little bit of a step back fantasy-wise. Still somebody you're going to keep in your lineup, but just something I was noticing along the way when I'm doing rest of season projections, when I'm doing, week 12 projections, all that sort of stuff.
No, it's a great question because I kind of compare it to the Puka Nacua discourse right now, which is when, beyond the fact like he's taking fewer snaps because of the 13 personnel stuff, which I talked about earlier this week. I wrote a piece about that as well, which I really don't think is going to end up mattering that much. I think that they will end up, as I said with Ray, they're going to play more 11 personnel when they get to certain situations. But just brass tacks wise, the first 5 weeks of the season, Puka Nacua averaging 21 fantasy points per game. Since week 9, he's at 15, which 15 fantasy points per game is still awesome from your wide receiver 1. It's just not 21 points per game. And I think you could also say that about this Colts offense, where are they going to be a really good offense the rest of the way? Absolutely. I have a lot of faith that this team will not fall off the freaking cliff. But they have been a historic offense to start this year. From an efficiency standpoint, they lead all offenses in points per drive. What if they just take If they take 2 steps back, they'd still be a top 10, top 12 type of offense, which I think is enough to support JT being a fantasy RB1, but is it enough to make him kind of an absolute monster as he's been, a true different, if you don't have this guy, you're not going to win your league type player. There's a chance. So I don't really know what to do with that information, but it is right to bring it up that they play the Texans. They're first in EPA per play allowed on defense. The Seahawks are 3rd. The Chiefs are 14th. And even Jacksonville's 13th. These are some of the best defenses in the league that he's going to have to play in the next 4 weeks.
Yeah, the Jags are the one there where it looks like the easiest matchup in the world. And yet against the run, that's one thing that they do pretty well. They stop fantasy running backs, or at least slow them down. So yeah, again, do you go out and just gauge what you could get in a trade? You're probably not going to get the kind of value that's going to make you want to move Jonathan Taylor, and you don't want to be the person that traded away Jonathan Taylor and looks like a complete idiot for doing so because he goes to another team and leads them to a fantasy championship, right? But it's just maybe I'm getting ahead of the panic meter messages that we'll get on Monday if he does have a slower game one of these weeks and people start to go, hey, what's going on with JT? What's happening with him here? I could just see him taking, that slight step back, not huge, not an area where you're going to consider taking out of your lineup, but just that slight step back off some of the, the stats that we've seen from him. And maybe that would allow someone else to step up and be that, not necessarily the guy that he's been so far, but be that RB1 overall that's leading people to a fantasy title.
I will just admit to the people, be honest for a second, I would never have the stones to do what Boone just outlined there. Okay, I would never have the stones to do it. Like trade Jonathan Taylor, absolutely couldn't do it. Complete coward, would never be able to do it. So that's why Boone might be a little bit sharper at this stuff than I am. Worth noting, just when we're looking at this schedule here, the Chiefs in terms of run defense, they're probably the most generous matchup. If you're looking at like EPA and success rate wise, they're the lowest ranked defense. So, and I actually think front four wise, they present problems in the passing game in certain ways, but I think you can get after them. And I think actually there's some matchups that favor the Colts offense versus their defense. But yeah, it'll be interesting to watch this first matchup just to test this theory. But let's get to your next question here as we keep it moving.
Well, this one seemed a lot more exciting this morning. Like I said, when I came up with it, just looking at what could the potential return of some of these injured running backs mean for their backfields. And when I first put this list together, I thought there was a pretty good shot we were going to see all these guys this week, right? Isaiah Pacheco for the Chiefs, Ramondre Stevenson for the Patriots, Trey Benson, who's had his 21-day practice window open. He's back at practice for the Cardinals, and then Bucky Irving for the Buccaneers. And now we're looking at it. We're going, okay, Isaiah Pacheco went from a full practice yesterday to limited today. Last I saw, Ramondre Stevenson still limited. Trey Benson still limited. Bucky Irving still limited. And there's a report out there from Rondé Barber suggesting that maybe Bucky Irving won't be back for the Sunday night matchup. Maybe it's more likely that we'll see him in the coming weeks here. So not quite as exciting maybe for week 12, but I still think we should talk through some of these because it's possible that we could see at least the first three play this week. And when they do come back, it's going to have a big impact fantasy wise on the running backs that people have been using in these backfields. And starting with the Chiefs, I mean, Pacheco missed the last two games with that knee injury. There was also a bye in there. The fact that he came back to a full practice got me really excited that, okay, the guy we saw before he got hurt, he started to come on just a little bit and not to the area that he was like in years past. We saw him for stretches put up like top 15 fantasy numbers. It wasn't like that at all, but we did see him have some good games, right? At least 50 scrimmage yards and or a touchdown in 5 straight games before he got hurt. And again, he's not going over 100 yards every week, but that's still decent production that's going to get you in people's lineups as a high-end RB3 with some RB2 upside those weeks where he finds the end zone. And he's coming back to a Chiefs offense that is definitely better than the one that he was struggling to produce points with early in the season, right? They had all those injuries early in the year. The offense was not doing much. Rashee Rice wasn't out there yet. They still have their problems. Don't get me wrong. This is not a perfect offense by any means, but they're definitely better than what they were in that first month when he was having a hard time putting up fantasy points. So if he comes back healthy, I think he will have a shot to put up some points. If it happens this week, though, if he comes back after, downgrade to limited practice and all that sort of stuff, if he's not 100% healthy when he returns, we're certainly going to see Kareem Hunt out there and maybe Kareem Hunt remain in the lead role for another week. But when we see Pacheco back to 100%, it's going to go back to you have Pacheco as that RB3 option for fantasy. You have Hunt as like that TD or bust flex play. And Brashard Smith is just kind of fallen behind, right? Like he's not really emerging as anything. So I bring him up here. I don't know if I'm allowed to bring him up here because he is in the coping corner, but I think that there's a possibility that once he's back healthy, we could see him put up some stats that might make us consider taking him out of the coping corner. So another one where I'm trying to get ahead on this, Harmon. Ramondre Stevenson, this is the whole reason why I brought up this section, because Ramondre Stevenson is like one of the biggest topics this week, right? What is going to happen when Ramondre Stevenson returns to the lineup, whether it's this week, whether it's next week? when he gets back out there, there's no possible way that Vrabel can give him the lead back role, right, Harmon? Like, there's no possible way that they can turn this into like a 50-50 committee even. After what we saw from Henderson the last 3 weeks, they can't do that to us, right? Like, it would just be insane. It would be coaching malpractice, in my opinion, if they give Stevenson a big enough role like that. He's going to factor in. He's going to be involved. But you can't go back to 50-50, and you can't go back to him in the lead role. Henderson has been outstanding. I think in this matchup this week against the Bengals, that adds like another wrinkle to all of this, because if Stevenson doesn't play, there might be a chance that like Henderson could set the single game rushing record in this one. Like, the Bengals defense has been terrible this season, right? The absolute best matchup for fantasy
really
backs.
reasonable.
Well, I'm wondering whether Stevenson is seeing this matchup coming up, seeing how well Henderson's played, and been like, I got to get back out there, man. If I don't get back out there this week, it's over for me. Like, this guy is going to just sign, seal, deliver, take over this backfield. So a little bit worried, I won't lie. A little bit of concern that they're going to do something weird and take the top off of Henderson's fantasy potential and move him down. But because of this matchup, there's a chance that if Stevenson plays, both these guys could get home, because we've seen multiple backs go up against the Chiefs and put up good points in the same game, right? We've seen 8 different teams have a second back put up at least 50 scrimmage yards and or a touchdown in their game against the Bengals. So we often see multiple backs from the same team produce. So maybe if Stevenson's out there, we'll still have Henderson go off, and we'll see Stevenson put up enough fantasy points to get into lineups. It's possible, but this is the one that I'm definitely seriously concerned about. Trey Benson, I'm very excited about, and I don't know if we want to go into it too much because I think he talked about it with Joel yesterday, but you think back to what this offense was early in the year. He was splitting time with James Conner. Then he finally gets his opportunity and he gets hurt. We didn't get a chance to see what Benson could be in this offense. And now this offense is different with Jacoby Brissett under center, right? And I think he has a chance to be even more successful coming back. Again, as long as he's healthy, I think he could come back and really make a difference down the stretch and push all these other guys down, a notch or two to a role that they make a lot more sense in. I know that Amari DeMarcado's hurt right now, but he did have some moments while Benson was out here. Michael Carter, Bam Knight, all these guys had a little bit of fantasy success here and there along the way. Benson is the guy that could come in and potentially consolidate that. I don't know if it would happen this week. I think his first game back, they're probably going to have other guys involved. But eventually, if he's healthy, some absolutely fantastic matchups in the fantasy playoffs, right? The Falcons in week 16 and gets this Bengals defense that I just talked about in week 17. So he's somebody that definitely has to be on people's radar as a potential trade candidate, even though I don't think that's going to happen this week because people are waiting for him to come back. You try to trade for him the week that he's returning. Probably not going to happen unless you're willing to pay up. But if you have him on your roster, a guy who could help you potentially win a fantasy title. And then the Bucky Irving one, I think maybe we push that back a week. It's interesting. And maybe I was wrong when I did the waiver wire show on Monday with you. And I kind of just pushed Sean Tucker to the side a little bit, thinking that Bucky Irving, after practicing limited last week, would come back this week and be available. And now it doesn't seem like that's going to be the case. So Sean Tucker, some nice quotes from the coaching staff this week saying that they want to get him more work. I just will caution, like I did to producer Colin in our chat today, that going from a matchup against the Bills defense, which is very friendly to fantasy running backs, going to a matchup against the Rams this week, which is completely the opposite and one of the toughest matchups, I just think we have to factor that in. I don't think he's going to run wild in this one like he did last week.
Do you think he's still a fantasy starter though, Sean Tucker? If there's no Bucky Irving, and it's to me, I feel like he's going to end up the lead back, get more touches at least over Rachaad White.
Yeah, no, for sure he would be usable in fantasy. I just think if people are chasing a game where, he's over 100 yards and 3 touchdowns, whatever it came out to there,
sure.
I don't think he's going to be anywhere close to that. I think we're looking more at a guy who's like an RB3, is still in a split with Rachaad White. I think they're both kind of going to be in that RB3 range, but I'll have Tucker ranked higher, which I already do.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Also, because I've got Tucker on at least a couple rosters, so I need your advice on what to do with him, so I really appreciate that. Let's stick in Tampa Bay and get to your third question of the week.
This one's tough, Harmon. This one's really tough. What is going on with Emeka Egbuka? And I'm coming to you on this one a little bit to try to give me some guidance, give me some insight on this, because I want to know what has happened to the guy that was out there in the first month of the season, was the wide receiver 3 overall through the first 5 weeks, And then since then is the wide receiver 38 in fantasy points per game. Like, there was an injury at one point for sure. There's been a ton of injuries around him on the offense, not just to the receiving core, to the offensive line as well. But I have one team, for example, where I had Egbuka going off early in the year. It's the team that I brought up last time around where it's that charity league where nothing is going right for me. There's injuries. I'm facing like the top scorer every single week. And I was waiting for Rashee Rice to come back because, great, I'm going to pair him with Egbuka. I'm going to have this awesome receiving core. And then right around the time that Rice comes back, Egbuka just falls off the map fantasy-wise, right? You look at, his last 5 games here, 4 of them under 10 fantasy points, like barely usable for fantasy. We're still continuing to put him in our lineups because you're not going to sit Emeka Egbuka. And yet still on the year, wide receiver 10 looks very, very misleading in fantasy points per game because it all happened early in the season. And I really don't know, like, looking at this offense, other than the fact that they've had their struggles along the way and that he's getting a lot of defensive attention because no Chris Godwin, no Mike Evans, he is the guy out there now. And I wonder if the injury is lingering a little bit. He's playing through it, if that's sort of the case here. But man, it is very tough to look at this week's matchup against that Rams defense and think that this is like some fantastic bounce back spot. They're pretty good against receivers. I think that defense overall is pretty strong. They can get after this Bucs offense. We also have a scenario where a bunch of guys on the Bucs are dealing with an illness early this week, including Emeka Egbuka. So normally after a couple of days, all those guys are fine and they'll play. But to start the week, after all these issues we're talking about, we're going to start the week with Baker Mayfield and Egbuka and everybody having a cold or something. That's not great. That doesn't get you very excited for fantasy. So it's just overall like a bit of a concerning situation, to the point where should people be out here wondering whether they should maybe trade him, try to capitalize on the name and get somebody else that can produce or that they feel better about down the stretch here? Would you be buying, holding, or selling Egbuka the rest of the way?
I think I would be holding. There's a couple things to talk about here. Number one, you mentioned the just dramatic splits and how the overall number is misleading, and a lot of that happened in the first half of the year. That's just kind of how it goes at this position. Sometimes you find these pockets where they're great, and then there's pockets where they're not. Drake London was kind of the inverse of that, where he was a little bit mid to start the year and then had some of the best wide receiver performances we've seen all year in the second chunk of the season. So this third act really for Egbuka will be very telling. Now, if we can diagnose some of what's going on here, I think you mentioned he's wide receiver 30 in points per game since week 7, which is that Lions game where he picked, like right before that, he picked up the hamstring injury and then he came out and played. He's wide receiver 30. His teammate Tez Johnson is wide receiver 29 in points per game, by the way. But meanwhile, in that same span, it's like a point something difference, so who cares? But in that same span, he is tied with Amon-Ra St. Brown with 43 targets. That's 6th most among wide receivers. He's just caught 18 passes for 248 yards, 1 touchdown. He's had 3 drops in this span. So that's a little bit part of the story here. There's just been a couple plays left on the field. But the other part of it, too, is just you mentioned the defensive attention. All those other teams know what he was doing in the first half of the year, and then they can also watch all these other guys. And I think this happens sometimes where teams have injuries and they get away with it with their depth. Sterling Shepard, Tez Johnson. But the longer it goes on, the more you're like, okay, these guys are nice players. We're not scared of Tez Johnson. We're not scared of Sterling Shepard. And I think he's getting a lot of these cloud coverages, true brackets, double teams, which is very rare for any rookie. And the other complicating part of this, and this is where I kind of go both ways on it here, is because he is their best receiver by a mile, he's also been playing so much X receiver outside on the line of scrimmage. He's about a third of his snaps have been in the slot, which is good. And even in this stretch, though, it's 24% of his snaps in the slot. And you saw that like they had to move him into the slot at times to get him favorable matchups against New England, where he had his one good game in the stretch here. And that's just because, hey, like Tez Johnson is not playing X. Sterling Shepard is not playing X receiver. It has to be Emeka Egbuka, and that's made it easier for defenses to take him away. So I kind of go back and forth on whether we should really panic about this or not. I don't think it's a him issue. I just think it's some of the structural reasons we're kind of laying out here right now. I will say that he has had some big splits in terms of being great against man versus zone coverage in terms of his production, which Baker has had big splits in terms of his production versus man and zone. And the Rams are 10th in terms of zone coverage rate this year. So this could be a better matchup for him this week against that secondary, even if it is an overall strong unit there in LA.
We've talked about the 49ers offense and how in recent weeks they've started to get some of these guys back, and down the stretch they could really make an impact. I wonder if we'll see something like that from the Bucs if we can get these guys back, like Bucky Irving, like some guys on the line, like Godwin, eventually Evans. Could we see like a full power Bucs offense in the final month of the season that really makes a difference, even though throughout the season it's been a bit of a struggle some weeks here, and we saw a great start to the year for Egbuka, but with all these injuries, it has eventually taken its toll, and this offense hasn't been anywhere near what I projected before the season because of it.
Right. Think about the Jalen McMillan stretch from last year, and Egbuka's a significantly better player than Jalen McMillan, but it was when Mike Evans got back that then Jalen McMillan started really popping off, because I know we're always obsessed in fantasy about target competition and who's taking looks away from our guys. But sometimes when there are more players available, one, it gives defenses to think about, and plus makes the offense better, which contributes to longer drives, contributes to more touchdown opportunities. And that is certainly what I think what this Bucs team needs right now. So that's a really good point by you. I just don't know, Boone, like, is Chris Godwin coming back? Is Mike Evans coming back? When are they going to come back? Or is it going to be this kind of Emeka Egbuka, Sterling Shepard, Tez Johnson situation for the long term?
This really weird, like Bucky Irving, Chris Godwin are back at practice in a limited fashion, and yet we're not really clear about when and if they're going to return, has been very, very frustrating for fantasy and makes it very tough for us to give definitive answers to people on moves that they can make before the trade deadline, which the default trade deadline for Yahoo is this week in most leagues. And it's really tough to try to figure out what to do with those players. And in the end, I really come down to holding on a lot of them just because, kind of going back to the Jonathan Taylor thing, you don't want to trade away a Bucky Irving and then have him come back, take over this backfield with a pretty easy schedule down the stretch, and end up being one of those difference makers that has a huge impact on fantasy championships.
Yeah, I think that's probably the right way to approach it. Okay, we're going to take our first quick break. We come back. We've got more questions to answer for Week 12. We'll get into that right after this. All right, we're back. We're continuing to run through questions for Week 12. Let's get into these next two here, Boone, which are kind of a pair. And I will say before we get to this question, I'm going to miss you giving these trade advice, kind of segments here, pal, because let me tell you what, the trade deadline, as you mentioned in the first segment, is coming up here on Saturday. I suck at this portion of fantasy analysis. I'm just not really, I can kind of be, hey, this guy's, he's trending up. I'd like to buy this guy, but then people come with the specific trade questions. I don't know. I'm a terrible fantasy trader. It's something I'm not very good at. So I stink at giving this advice. So I mean this sincerely. I am actually going to miss you talking about this because you're much better at than me, and you've been a good value add to the show.
Well, I appreciate that, but I will also say trades, like anything in fantasy, it's like a game of probabilities, right? Like you're just trying to win more than you lose, and you hope that, 6 out of 10 trades you're going to get the benefit on, and that's going to give you an edge. It's not necessarily that every single one is going to be a slam dunk here. So I'm hoping that the 8 guys that I'm going to mention in terms of buys and sells coming up, that all of these guys come through in the way that I say, but I know that it's probably going to end up being like 6 out of 8, and there'll be a couple that I get wrong, and I'll hear about it from everybody on those players. But let's get to them anyway here. All right, so let's start off. 4 players that I think people should be buying with a couple days left before the trade deadline. And of course, there's some leagues where the trade deadline is going to be a week or 2 away. That's fine too. But this week, a lot of leagues are going to have to deal with it. So the 4 players that I want to mention, I went with 1 at every position: Jared Goff, Kenneth Walker, Chris Olave, and Theo Johnson. For Jared Goff, nothing new on this one. I've talked about the Lions' schedule and how they were going to have to go on the road outdoors against that tough Eagles defense, but that after that, they were going to have 6 straight games indoors, 4 of those taking place back home in the Dome, the friendly confines of Ford Field, where they tend to be more successful on offense, where they tend to put up a lot of fantasy points. I think that's going to happen again here, and I think that's a reason to go out and try to get Jared Goff if you need a quarterback, if you want to try to find that guy who is a QB2, but who the rest of the way could get hot and end up being that low-end to mid-range QB1. We've seen him do it before. Last year, he was a top 10 fantasy quarterback. It would not surprise me at all if he does something like that again the rest of the way. And he's going to get the benefit here of facing the Giants and the Cowboys in 2 of his upcoming 3 outings. They're among the 3 most generous defenses for fantasy quarterbacks. So he gets a couple nice matchups to get that positive momentum going. Very excited about him potentially getting back to what we saw last year. And I would say, I think with Goff and with this Lions offense, you and I have basically nailed it all year long in terms of when and how they were going to produce, some of the struggles they were going to have. I think we're going to be bang on here again, that this is a spot where they're going to finish the season very, very strong. Kenneth Walker. So this is an interesting one.
Let's
right?
hear it,
because
buddy.
Another guy.
You're a Kenneth Walker
it's
guy.
Another guy who's in the coping corner.
Let's hear it.
I'm really going out on a limb here talking about people who are in the coping corner, maybe breaking all the rules. But I've been looking at Kenneth Walker a bunch this week because I've been trying to find sort of discounted or cheaper running backs that I could pick up, that I could slide into my flex spot, that I could maybe use as an RB2 the rest of the way, who I think could potentially get back to the type of production that I thought that they could have before the season. And there are not a lot of guys in that scenario, right? There's a lot of players who their situation has changed, or they're dealing with injuries, or a lot of things have happened along the way. But Kenneth Walker, there's some signs here pointing to him potentially making his way out of the coping corner and potentially becoming a fantasy asset who you could feel really good about, who could potentially lead you to a fantasy title down the stretch. And the results so far for him, RB24 production on a per game basis. And I was almost surprised that it was RB24. I thought that was actually better than I expected it to be when I looked up the season long numbers. Now that's through the first 10 games. Now we have a chance for him to potentially go out and show that he can be a player that I thought he was going to be before the season here, Harmon. And some of the reasons that I'm excited for him, he just delivered his best fantasy performance. He had 16 carries for 67 yards and a touchdown. He also had 3 catches for 44 yards. He was the RB10 on the week against a pretty difficult Rams defense. So for him to do that in a good matchup, that is definitely a good sign. We also had some quotes coming out from the coaches. His head coach, Mike McDonald, saying, quote, "It just shows you that he's such an explosive player with the ball in his hands, and he knows there's things that he needs to clean up in his game too. He's done a great job in practice doing that, and will continue to do that. I think Ken's showing that he deserves some more opportunities." And Harmon, this is where I tip my hat to you, because you talked about the idea when we put him in the coping corner that maybe as the season goes along, they will start to give him more work. Maybe they were protecting him early in the season, a guy that's gotten hurt in past years. They want to have him healthy when the games matter the most, late in the season and into the playoffs. Could we be seeing that happen here? And it's not that Zach Charbonnet is going to be phased out of the offense, right? It's not going to happen like that at all. But Walker deserves more touches. He's the more explosive player. He's the guy that can help them get through some of these tougher matchups like we saw last week. And his next opponent here, and we're talking about getting some positive momentum going, he's going up against the Titans. It's the friendliest matchup that he has faced all year long. They're giving up the 5th most fantasy points to running backs. I think that is going to be the start of him getting on a hot streak and really producing for fantasy in a way that matters the rest of the way. Do you want to comment on that one before I talk about anyone else? Because I think that is a big one in terms of this section.
Oh yeah. And I mean, you're playing my exact music here. This is what I was kind of predicting would happen. I said it on Football 301 before I said it on this show to you, that I feel like we're going to get a December to remember with Kenneth Walker here, because it just makes sense. He is a guy that has never finished an NFL season. And I think the Seahawks team knew very early on, okay, we're going places. Like this defense is good. The offense is outrageously efficient. The one thing that they haven't done all that well is run the ball. And I think actually now they're reaching a point offensively where they need that counterpunch. They need the run game now to step up, because number one, I'm not saying, oh, Sam Darnold turned back into a pumpkin or whatever, but he does have some weaknesses in his game, weaknesses that a great defensive coordinator like Chris Shula, who, by the way, they're going to face again this season. They're going to face the Rams again, and they hope to face them again in the playoffs and win those games. They want to win those games. Part of what they can do is kind of take the load off of Sam Darnold and not expect him to be the most efficient quarterback on a per drop back basis in the NFL if they can get that run game boosted up. And I think the easiest and best path, not saying it's definitely going to happen, but best path to do it would be to have Kenneth Walker add those explosive runs to the mix here. So yeah, to me, it just makes sense, man. Save him until the games really, really matter, both from our standpoint in fantasy and certainly for the Seahawks in the real NFL.
Let's hope it happens, because I definitely made some predictions before the season about Kenneth Walker that have been nowhere near coming true. And if he finishes strong,
we got to close that.
We'll remember it in a positive way. Yeah, we'll be able to look back. And
go, let me tell you what, that's true though.
Titles.
Yes, that is 1,000% what most people will be like. Wow, Kenneth Walker was awesome in 2025 if he just finishes the season as like the running back 6 or something.
Exactly. Another guy that I think could finish really hot here is Chris Olave, and this isn't the first time that I've recommended buying him. Mm-hmm. He's definitely popped up in my buy-sell column multiple times this year. Been getting consistent opportunities, right? And now you have Rashid Shaheed out of the way. Brandon Cooks now gets released this week. Olave already was 5th in overall targets among receivers on the season. So I don't know that he can get that much more volume, but certainly solidifies the type of volume that he's been getting. And thanks to some better stat lines, because he was getting the volume, but wasn't really producing early in the year. More recently, he started to have some better games. He's up to wide receiver 14 in fantasy points per game and half PPR. He just doesn't get the same kind of fanfare that some of the other top wideouts get. And part of that might be the priors that people hold with the injury stuff and the concussion risk. And also just that he's playing for the Saints, right? And they're not a playoff contender. They're not, that exciting of a team when compared to some others. And I think, the fact that he's coming off a bye here, also just another reason that he's out of people's minds. But do not let that discourage you. I would go make an offer for him this week. I think he is locked in as a top 20 fantasy receiver, probably a top 15 fantasy receiver based on the volume that he gets. I think he's a guy that could propel himself into wide receiver 1 status down the stretch here. And then Theo Johnson at tight end. Jackson Dart expected to return to the Giants lineup this week, and that puts Theo Johnson right back in the fantasy tight end 1 conversation. And it's not a knock on Jameis Winston, who got the start last week, but in the games here where we saw Dart out there were 7 games with Dart as the starter. Johnson was a top 10 fantasy tight end in those games on a per game basis. And a lot of it is the injuries to the receiving core. Of course, they got to find somebody to throw to, and he's one of those guys, but they've made him a meaningful piece of that offense. And I think fantasy wise, you might not even have to trade for him because he's available in 41% of fantasy leagues still. So you could potentially go get him off the waiver wire if he's still out there in your league, but somebody that I think you're going to be able to use down the stretch for sure.
I was going to say that's your easiest buy because for most people out there, you can just go waiver wire click ad right now before this week of games. So you can just go ahead and grab Theo Johnson. I will just echo your point on Chris Olave here. I just think he's really underrated. And I thought this in the offseason when I put out my wide receivers, the top 15 wide receivers, 25 and under. I have some takes on that I regret for sure. But one thing that just consistent pushback I got from that list was I had Chris Olave way too high. People in the offseason thought Chris Olave like legitimately wasn't good at football. And to me, the pushback was no. This, I'm telling you guys, number one, he's really, really, really good in isolation. He just hasn't stayed healthy, number one, and two, has not played an offense that's well designed other than the little stint with Clint Kubiak last year, but then he started getting banged up. Like that offense that he started out with Pete Carmichael at the helm was archaic. I mean, truly like ancient NFL stuff that is not equipped for today's league. Now we see him in Kellen Moore's offense. In weeks 1 to 5, he was second in the NFL in targets, 40th in receiving yards. In the game since then, it's like completely flipped where he's actually still getting a good amount of targets. He ranks seventh but he ranks seventh in yards per game. So like the yards have now started to accumulate with the targets. I like the way Tyler Shuck played 141 air yards against Carolina the game before the bye. More of those downfield looks will make Chris Olave truly like I love that top 15 fantasy receiver. He's definitely somebody, even sentiment wise, I think it's not caught up to the production this year. So really good call out there. Okay, let's get to the next question here and essentially the negative side of what we're doing before the trade deadline.
Yeah, which players should you be selling before the trade deadline? And again, I have 4 here, and we could tie it into what we said earlier about some of the guys that you could consider selling. That this is the one that's very difficult for people to do because you don't want to look foolish. You don't want to trade that player away at this point in the season and have them go to another manager and help them win a title. And yet, I think the 4 names that I picked here, I feel pretty confident that they're not going to do that. Yeah, so it's Justin Herbert at quarterback. It's Travis Etienne at running back, Deebo Samuel at receiver, and Jake Ferguson. And you're not trading these guys for huge hauls. You're not getting RB1s and wide receiver ones in return. You're probably packaging these guys with someone else to try to get a player that you have more confidence in down the stretch. And the Herbert one is obvious. It's not his fault by any means. It's all the injuries on that offensive line. It just changes the way that they're going to play. You know, when he returns from the week 12 bye, he does come back to a pretty soft matchup against the Raiders, but he's got dates with the Eagles and the Chiefs and the Texans. He's got all those coming up here for the rest of the way. It's not going to look good, I don't think. When they face teams that have strong defensive fronts, that offensive line does not have anyone coming to save them. The injuries are just going to take a toll here, and it's going to impact Herbert's production. So consider him like a risky low-end QB1, but I honestly think there's a chance he ends up being more of a fantasy QB2 just because of all those injuries and some of those matchups. For Travis Etienne, a lot of things have happened here, right? And he's been good for fantasy this year. He definitely has. I think we got to give him that. And yet last week, we might have seen the start of a change in that backfield. We talked about it on Monday with Bashal Tutin before he got hurt, 15 carries, Travis Etienne's 12. Wasn't necessarily a complete takeover, but maybe a sign that this could become more of a 50-50 type committee. Now today, before we came on here, I saw that Travis Etienne is at practice in a non-contact jersey, that he is limited now. And we have Bashal Tutin looking like he is fine, even though he got dinged up in that game, that he is going to be able to play this week. So that might just be another thing that propels Bashal Tutin into more of a role in this offense. And I think that just takes the top off for Etienne. And there's always the possibility that because this coaching staff isn't tied to him, that we do see them start to give more chances to that rookie that they really like, and a guy that I think is eventually going to be the lead back in this offense, whether that happens down the stretch here or whether that happens next season. I think Tutin definitely has shown enough that he's going to get his chance to be the guy. And if it happens this year, I don't think, even if it's an injury, I don't think he would give the job back. I think if he gets out there into a role where he's the lead back in the offense, he is going to look so good. He's already flashed on his limited opportunities that he would look so good in that role that I think Travis Etienne would lose his job because of it. And still be involved, but just be on the lower side of the committee there. So I think that is one that you could look to sell before it's too late. Deebo Samuel, this one's obvious, right? He's been getting by with the touchdown production. He hasn't been great this year. We don't know if and when Jaden Daniels is coming back. We don't know if Terry McLaurin's going to come back and factor in and maybe take some targets away from him and how that could change things for this offense. So Debo looks like he's lost a step. I think if you could capitalize on the fact that he scored some touchdowns recently, get rid of him, get him off your team. And again, 1-for-1, you might not get a big return, but package him with another starter and try to upgrade somewhere if you can. And then Jake Ferguson, this one's tough because he's had a good season. He is a good player. And yet, since we got those wide receivers healthy, we have Pickens, we got CeeDee Lamb, the numbers have started to decline for Ferguson. And this past week, I mean, it was 16 yards. He just saved it with a touchdown. It's going to be a lot more like that along the way. And you're going to need those touchdowns from him to produce. So I am very worried. I mean, relying on touchdown production is a dangerous game. His next two opponents here, the Eagles and the Chiefs, they're both top 7 in terms of hardest matchups for fantasy tight ends here. At this point in the season, I know most people aren't trading their starting fantasy tight end, but I would look to do it because I think people are viewing him, and we talked about it's all about perception. I think people still view Ferguson as that potential top 5 receiver at top 5 tight end, and I just don't think he's that guy anymore. I don't think he's going to produce like that the rest of the way, and there's a lot of other names at tight end. You look to like the low-end tight end 1 type guys that could potentially usurp him, could jump him the rest of the season. So I think you should look at Ferguson as somebody that you might want to get rid of if you can, even though trades at the one-off positions can be tough.
Yeah, if like Theo Johnson's available, maybe you pick him up and see how that goes, and you try to get something for Jake Ferguson to upgrade, somewhere like a 2-for-1 type thing to upgrade, and one of your running backs or wide receivers. I think that's possible. Funny note, because I have a couple Justin Herbert teams, and I'm very nervous about how it's going to go, and they're some of my best teams this year, including a team that I was like, did I pick up somebody for a backup? I did pick up Bryce Young for the bye week this week, but I pulled this team up as we're looking at it. On this team, Justin Herbert's the quarterback. I have Travis Etienne at running back, and I have Jake Ferguson as the starting tight end, and I'm like, oh no!
Oh no.
I've got 3 of these guys. Boone's like, you need to trade these fools away.
Just
and this
trade
team's
them all.
Wide receiver,
yeah.
This team's wide receiver 1 was Drake London, so it's a head-to-head and a median league, so you're against the points too. And I'm third. I'm doing well, but I feel like I'm gonna fight to the end, but I don't know if I've got the win in me based on this conversation we're having right now.
That team seems a little Chargers-esque, right? Where like you're a good team, but the injuries are mounting, and you start to worry about whether these guys are going to keep producing down the stretch for you. Yeah, for sure.
I also have Marvin Harrison Jr., who just loves seeing that O with the appendicitis. Give me a freaking break, Marvin Harrison. God, yeah. Unbelievable.
Right, okay, so
I would say right when he was coming on, I would say if I would just order these that I think least to most likely to make you look stupid. I think the least likely to make you look stupid is Debo. I think that's a good sell. I just think at this point, he's coming off that game against the Dolphins, but I agree with you taking a step back. The offense is questionable. Mariota, Terry McLaurin coming back, the whole deal. I would say maybe Jake Ferguson, just because I agree with you. If this defense, as Nate and I were talking about, goes from 31st to 21st in the league, I don't think they're going to become a great defense, but with some of these additions, they go from being a complete doormat to functional. It's just going to take some of this passing volume away, and I think there's no shot that CeeDee Lamb's losing his slice of the pie. I think there's no shot that George Pickens is losing his slice. I think Ferguson would be the guy to get banged there from a target perspective. I think Herbert probably next in terms of he's just so good, and like we've seen they can put together a game plan to get the ball out fast like they did against the Steelers, and it's not like he was a great fantasy quarterback there, but it was functional. I think it's kind of a tie, honestly, between Ferguson and Herbert. And then the guy that I think could make you look bad is Travis Etienne, just because, and I'm not saying that just because I've got him on this fantasy team and a couple others. I'm not just saying it because of that. But I do think that run game is really coming along, and I actually think there's room for both of these guys to be useful and usable in fantasy, even if Tootin takes a step forward. Just because I think they want to take the air out of the ball at this point. I don't think Liam Cohen fully trusts Trevor Lawrence. They've obviously had their hiccups in the past game overall. Yeah, I feel like they want to take that air out of the football a little bit. And, there's some games down the stretch where I think I could see Jacksonville just putting it in both backs' bellies over and over and over again. And, that's obviously week 13. Even this matchup against Arizona, but week 13 against the Titans, there's definitely Jets week 15. There's some spots here where they could be running the football a lot.
Yeah, I agree with that. And again, like Etienne has played really well. And the main change right now that's happening is that there's this young running back who's starting to potentially threaten him. And we'll see what happens with the injury this week. But I'm basing a lot of this on the potential for Bashal Tuna. And it's funny, and this sometimes does inform or impact our opinions. I have a lot of Bashal Tuna on my team. So maybe that's pushing me a little bit in that direction to talk down about Etienne and talk up Tootin here, because I definitely think that we've seen enough from him that he deserves more opportunities. I wasn't sure that it was going to come because after the Bigsby trade happened, I thought that would be the opportunity for it to come. With a lot of these rookies, it's taken a little bit longer. Now it's potentially going to happen, but I do agree with you that they're going to run the ball as much as they possibly can. That it seems like Liam Cohen has just lost confidence in Trevor Lawrence, and I mean, can you blame him right now, right? There's been a lot of things that have changed in that offense, injuries in the receiving core and stuff. But yeah, Trevor Lawrence just not really looking like the franchise quarterback that franchise thought that they were getting when they drafted him. And now Liam Cohen's trying to figure it out. And Liam Cohen, I have a lot of faith in him that he is going to be able to figure it out. I wonder whether Lawrence is going to be the quarterback long-term there, but that's a conversation probably for the offseason. Right now, just look at it and go, yeah, that backfield is one that could be good for fantasy. I think it's going to lean towards Tootin the rest of the way. I think Etienne could have value, but I think right now you'd be selling him at the peak of his value in my mind based on what he's done so far this season.
Yeah, and he just had that big game, so it would definitely be the optimal time to do it. Okay, sixth and final question for the weekend. This one's a little bit different. We got a twist for this sixth question.
Yeah, and I will shout out producer Colin on this one, that he came up with this idea, brought it up a couple weeks ago that we should try this, and I was like, no, I got a lot I want to talk about. We're not going to do it this week. This week, I was like, you know what? He reminded me, and I was like, that's a great call. Let's get one in here. So we threw it out to my followers, to the listeners, to see if anyone had a question that they wanted answered that would make sense, right? And I will apologize because I didn't specify, but there were a lot of like start sit kind of questions. We weren't going to address that on the show.
Always
something more
always got to
general.
specify no start sit. Yeah.
Yeah, we got a lot of those. But yeah, we got a few that were really good, sort of general questions. I'll try to jump back in and answer as many of them as I can on social media. But the one that I wanted to talk about today here is from LouPhil92. And the question is, what's the typical makeup of your bench at this time of year if you are on the cusp of the playoffs? Handcuff running backs for your starters, handcuffs for other manager starters, high upside, low volume players, or more stable assets, maybe even multiple defenses for PS matchups. I'm not sure what the PS there stands
playoff
for,
schedule.
But for the playoff.
Schedule.
Okay, for play, we'll just playoff matchups. Yeah. So I loved this question, Harmon, and you know me, like I love like, game tier stuff and trying to figure out like different ways you can approach and find edges. And I feel like I have a lot to say about this one. I feel like I've talked a lot on the show, so I will apologize, dude, but I'm going to go off again here. I think people should be looking at their bench. Yeah, it really depends. It really depends on where your team's at. If you're a contender versus if you're still fighting for a playoff spot, like there's a few different things that would factor in here. So don't get me wrong. Like, there's just like one approach that's like the be all and end all that you should follow. But I will say, like, depending on how your roster is constructed here, I'll give you an example. Like if you have an elite quarterback, if you have an elite tight end, there's really no reason to hold a backup. I know some leagues are deep. People hoard backup quarterbacks or backup tight ends. But if you have an elite player at the position, that should lock down that position for you, right? Versus if you've been streaming at that position, maybe you do want to set aside 2 roster spots and grab a guy and try to get ahead for the next week and do that sort of thing. So that is one thing that you're going to have to factor in. We're almost through bye weeks. So you try to just move past that. Once you get past bye weeks, you don't have to worry as much about those like 1 week fill-in types, right? So if you're in a deep league where people are hoarding all those positions, fine, grab 2 of them. Otherwise, we are 1 quarterback, we are 1 tight end, unless you're in a super flex league. Another example would be if you have 2 or 3 elite receivers, really high-end receivers. You don't need to spend bench spots on other receivers. Why would you do it, right? You have the top guys. If injuries strike, you're going to go to the waiver wire, like I always talk about, and you're going to grab a wide receiver 3 flex option, which there basically are every single week. If you grab someone and hold them on your bench, are they going to be that much more valuable than that? Probably not. So think about ways that you can use the waiver wire as like a tool, right? Use the waiver wire as your bench almost, and go and grab like that wide receiver 3 flex play when you need it, but don't carry that guy on your bench. Save that bench spot for somebody with higher upside, right? So, for example, on one of my teams, I have Jamar Chase and I have Rashee Rice and I have Garrett Wilson on IR. I'm just rolling with those guys. Even though Garrett Wilson's on IR, I'm not even picking up another receiver until Chase gets suspended. And I went out and I got Michael Wilson because that week Michael Wilson was available. And great, I have a guy who I've ranked as like a top 20, top 24 option this week. That's a particularly nice option to be able to slide into your lineup for a week or so. But still, that's the idea that you can go to the waiver wire and get that type of player. So I am, rolling with high-end starters when I have them at positions, and I'm not really spending much on my bench, except for running back. That is where, as Lou Phil there said, you want to spend as many spots as possible on backup running backs, on those guys that are one injury away, who could just blow up when they get that opportunity. And I mean, you look at it here, like it all leads me to my main point, right? Like that you want to try to get guys on your team that are going to have a huge impact on your roster the rest of the season. You don't want to have bench players that are just like, oh, it's great. I have Demario Douglas. Awesome. I can put him in my lineup this week and he's going to get me 6 to 10 fantasy points. No, you want these backup running backs that when an injury strikes their depth chart, they all of a sudden become top 20, maybe even top 10 fantasy options at their position. And all season long, I've been writing a backup running back column. A lot of the guys are still available in more than 50% of leagues, Harmon. So I want to mention a few of them here as guys that people should be targeting. Bashal Tutin, still available in 61% of leagues, despite everything we just said about him in the last segment there. Bashal Tutin, you can go out and still get him in a lot of spots. Sean Tucker, 51% available. So like right on the cusp there at the cutoff I used for the waiver wire article. And yet a guy that now that it looks Bucky Irving's not going to play this week, a guy that you can grab, have him in case Bucky Irving doesn't come back or gets hurt again at some point, but also a guy you could put in as a potential starter this week. Tyler Algier, 56% available. Brian Robinson Jr., 74% somehow, even though he's behind Christian McCaffrey, who's had quite the injury history, older running back. And if McCaffrey goes down, Brian Robinson Jr. is a top 12 fantasy back, I would say, the rest of the season. Blake Corum, Tank Bigsby, Devin Singletary, if you want to go a little lower. Heck, Chris Rodriguez, he might actually be the starter on his team, even though he's on bye this week. He's available in 85% of leagues. You can go deeper, though. Ray Davis, Ollie Gordon, Keaton Mitchell, who's behind Derrick Henry, who we definitely don't want to see Derrick Henry get hurt, especially with, the December months coming when Derrick Henry normally dominates. But if he went down, Keaton Mitchell would have quite the opportunity in that backfield. So there's just a lot of backups that you can have on your team right now that if the starter goes down, they are very exciting. They are empty your budget kind of pickups on the waiver wire, and you want to have those guys before those injuries happen. So to bring it full circle, totally upside is what we're shooting for every time. You want ceiling outcomes, unless you're dealing with injuries and buys, and then you have to make exceptions. Like I said, with the suspension for Chase, I had to make an exception in that instance. And then, once we get a couple weeks away from the playoffs, because they mentioned defenses, then you can start to stash defenses. A lot can change over the next couple weeks here, right? So don't too far out, go out and grab defenses, in hopes that they're going to make a huge difference for you. I don't think you need to waste the roster spot a month out. But I think a couple weeks before, you could start to look at the defensive matchups and who's available. Do not look at stashing a kicker, obviously, because there's always going to be kickers available. So you're not going to go out and get a kicker and put them on your bench. But if you really want to make an impact in your lineup, you really want to give yourself the best chance of finding that difference maker who's going to potentially help you in the fantasy playoffs and in the fantasy championship, you want to roster as many backup running backs as possible. That is always the way to go. And if we're talking about, because I will say one more thing in that question, was should you go for opponents' backups or your backups? I would normally always say go. Yeah, I was going to say, normally you would always go after just the top guys, the guys that have the biggest upside if an injury occurs. But when we get to this stage of the season, we do have a better view of which players have that opportunity, which guys might be in committees if an injury happens, which guys might be just pure volume plays and get a ton of work and step up that way. So for me, if my roster's set, if I like my flex play, I like my running back plays, I'm probably going to try to back those guys up with their backups. If my flex play is not great, my RB2 is not great, and I need to find another player to get me over the top, then you want to look elsewhere. Then you want to grab the other backup so you can get multiple starters if an injury occurs. That's how I would look at it. It just depends if you're still trying to fill spots in your starting lineup, or if your starting lineup is just awesome, then you back those guys up and you roll the rest of the way.
Number one, incredible analysis. I think you answered Lou's question in incredible depth, which was great. To your point about number one, by the way, I completely agree. Everything that you said there is exactly how I approach it too. Like, and being cutthroat at wide receiver is difficult for me because there's so many wide receivers I like, but you got to admit that there's a handful of guys that outside of the right matchup, you're just not starting at this point of the year, and they just simply do not belong on your fantasy bench. And I am definitely, I'm usually saving one spot even for like the most of the year to just churn and burn one random backup running back. You know, before it was Kyle Monungai, something like that. Now he's a little bit higher rostered, obviously, because he's had some big weeks. But just on the off chance that, DeAndre Swift misses a week, you've got yourself a starter. This is absolutely the time to be doing that. I love having the other person's backup. So just in case, instead of just, I replaced my starter with a lesser version of himself, I actually might have gained a starter. Also, you're playing defense there too. That's another thing that even if you're stacked at running back, don't look at it like, I don't need this guy, because you might be facing somebody in the fantasy playoffs that, they ended up with Sean Tucker as the league winner, and then he dropped one of his 30-point games on your head, and you're out of the postseason when you could have just picked him up yourself. So I agree with that. And my last point here, you got me thinking with all the backup running back talk. At some point, I think Colin said it's in the next we've got 2 more panic meter pods left. I think once we stop the panic meter, usually we go to the playoff trust meter, which is a whole, for new listeners, we'll get to it. We'll figure it out. I actually think we need to do one episode on just like gauging these backup running backs, bucketing them in sort of trust buckets of, if the starter went down, are we sure they're the backup? So I think that would actually be a helpful segment for people to expand on this topic, because it's one of the things I think about the most this time of the year is which running back could be that guy, the random hero at the end of the season, the quote league winner out of nowhere. The starter goes down. He gives us 2 weeks in the fantasy postseason. Who is that guy? So I think in a couple weeks, Boone, we'll sit down and we'll do a show on that.
I have my backup running back rankings that I do every Tuesday that will lend itself very well to that. Don't have them necessarily in buckets near the top. I have them just as the top 10, but I write up the top 10 every week. And of course it changes week to week. I think that is, oh my God, producer Colin writing his name is Phil Maffa in our show sheet. The diehard Cowboys fan, just diehard Cowboys fan. We're not necessarily stashing Phil Maffa right now. We might be stashing Malik Davis, actually, who looks like he's the backup at the moment to Javonte Williams. It's a very good point there. And I will say, to your point about playing defense, if there's a team in your league that, the number one team, the highest scoring team, they look like a juggernaut, that's the kind of team that you want to go and get the backups to their running backs, so that if that injury happens, all of a sudden that team gets knocked down a few pegs. Whereas if they're holding their backups, they're probably just going to run through everybody the rest of the way. So that kind of team, if it exists in your league, try to make sure you're getting the backup running backs to their stars, because that could make a huge difference down the stretch if there is some sort of injury.
Okay, perfect. Well, in the meantime, before we do this show where we take Boone's great analysis and I'll ruin it by putting it into stupid, meaningless buckets and hopefully still convey some decent information. In the meantime, make sure you're reading Boone's article on the site, the Backup Running Back Rankings, because we are reading again in 2025. Okay, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, it's time for literally no one's games of the week. We'll get into them right after this. All right, we're back. It's time. Let's get into literally no one's games of the week. Yawn always makes me laugh. It's so
good.
So funny. It's so good. Okay, first game up here, and we got 3 dust balls here. First game up, Jaguars at Cardinals. We kind of talked a little bit about this Jacksonville running back situation, Boone, but I am definitely paying attention to what the usage will be like between Tootin and ETN. Obviously, again, injury situation for Bashal Tootin, but at least worth monitoring this week. Also, do we get Brian Thomas Jr. back in this game? What's the usage for him versus a guy like Jacoby Myers? Myers is definitely coming on, man. He got a playing time bump this last week. That was good to see. I really like the way he fits with Trevor Lawrence. Trevor wants to throw that ball over the middle of the field. Whether he's always good at it is a separate question, but he wants to throw that ball over the middle, and Jacoby Myers is ready and willing and has the hands to go over the middle. And I think that could be impactful against this Cardinals defense because they are susceptible to some of those throws. So Jacoby Myers, I think this is probably the game that sets up best for him to be a fantasy starter. If you need help at wide receiver this week, I think he can be a good fill-in player this week against this team, especially because, like I said, got that playing time bump last week. We also might get Brenton Strange back in this game too. So, beyond the fact that I like the running backs in this game and I like Myers in this game, I also think there's a chance that we get some of these returning players for Jacksonville that might shake up a passing game that has just been a moving target for us all season long, both in how good it's going to be and who's actually running routes for this team.
Yeah, potentially guys returning on both sides here, right? Injuries are kind of the complicating factor across the board. Trey Benson coming back would be huge, but I think a guy like Brenton Strange, very underrated, a guy that last year was certainly a fantasy starter at tight end for stretches. And early in the season, he didn't find the end zone, but he was putting up pretty good yardage totals in the first month before he got hurt. So yeah, he's another one of those guys that could come in and get into the low-end tight end 1 fantasy conversation pretty quickly, especially with all these injuries at receiver there. You mentioned the Tootin injury. While you were talking, I quickly looked it up. So Tootin limited today, ETN limited today, and then ETN in the non-contact jersey, like I mentioned earlier. So it seems like Tootin's trending fine. They'll probably both play in this game, but yeah, a lot of injury stuff in this one to watch. And then hoping here that Michael Wilson can have another great performance in this one. I certainly need it on a few teams where I have him. I'm going to have him as a top 20 fantasy receiver this week. I think you got to put him right back up there. It's another good matchup for him. We know that Jacoby Brissett's been really solid at distributing the ball. And he played really, really well last week. I don't think he's that player. I don't think he's eventually going to, become the number 1 there or anything. When Harrison comes back, we're going to see him fall back to being that, 40 yards a week kind of wide receiver 4 flex option for fantasy. And Harrison hopefully will continue what he started before he got hurt, which was looking like he could be that wide receiver 2 for fantasy, but we don't know when he's going to return. An appendectomy can keep you out for multiple weeks, and now this is going to be the second week that he misses. So in the meantime, until he returns, I think Wilson is that low-end wide receiver 2 for fantasy and a guy that I feel pretty good about starting where I have to.
Yeah, they ruled Harrison out pretty quickly this week. There was not a lot of mystery there. That helps, obviously, if you picked up Michael Wilson. And I agree with you. I just want to say, I think Michael Wilson, is he a secret superstars, that type of guy? I don't know about that, but he's a good NFL receiver. He was one of these guys that in his rookie year reception perception profile was just over 70% success rate versus man and press. And if you're not familiar, you're new to reception perception, you don't read it very often. Totally fine, by the way. It hurts my feelings, but totally fine. If you don't read it, you don't consume it a lot. If you just want a quick and dirty way to be like, okay, what does this all mean? If you're an outside receiver and you're over 70% success rate versus man and press, we're interested in you in some degree, right? Those are just general good starters in the NFL, can kind of fit into that bucket. And I think that's where where Wilson really fits. And you look at the route tree here, that was something that stood out to me going back and charting this game, because of course I did that. He won in a variety of different ways. A lot of inbreakers, some vertical stuff where he played the ball well in the air. He does have a bit of an annoying habit of like leaving the ground as he's trying to like catch the ball. He's not like grounded through the catch, which I think you want to see that a little bit more. But that's also a thing Harrison does. So what are they coaching in that Arizona Cardinals wide receiver room? Maybe another question there. But again, can win in a variety of ways. So if I have him and I have him on a couple teams, I definitely think he's in starting range again this week.
Yeah, I totally agree. Trey McBride is an obvious one week in and week out, but if we can get Benson back, if we can get Harrison Jr. back, if Michael Wilson can continue to do something, Cardinals offense could have something going down the stretch here in terms of fantasy and getting a bunch of guys out there. And the Jags, it's funny, we thought they would be that team, right? We thought they would be the team that at this point in the season would have all these guys that we wanted to start. And yet now with some of the injuries they had in their receiving core, we're kind of picking and choosing who could potentially be the players that we want to have in our lineups right now. And I agree with you that Jacoby Myers, I think in limited usage so far has looked pretty good since he got there. He's a really good receiver, very underrated guy. So I think it's only a matter of time. Once he's up to speed there, he is going to start producing for fantasy. And of course, we're going to have to see what happens with BTJ and the injury there. But Jacoby Myers will be heard from in fantasy before the end of the year.
Arizona Cardinals #1 in passing yards per game since Jacoby Brissett took over. A game where I don't think we'll see a lot of passing yards. That's the next one here. Browns at Raiders. And I say this is no one's games of the week. There is a section of the internet that is very, very invested in this game because Shedeur Sanders is starting for the Cleveland Browns. We can just be honest here, straight up, folks. It was not good for Sanders in his first NFL action, but he's coming in cold off the bench. He's playing against a really good Ravens defense. So I don't know. I don't have a strong take about Shedeur Sanders, which I feel like in order to talk about Shedeur Sanders, you almost have to have a strong take one way or another, and you almost have to have like a diluted take to have some kind of conversation about Shedeur Sanders. I don't know about you, Boone. I don't have one of those opinions. I will just say from a fantasy standpoint, it's just he's a rookie quarterback who they didn't expect to start all year because, no kidding, he was drafted in the 5th round. He was the 3rd string quarterback in training camp. You don't expect that guy to start games. Usually if that guy's starting games for you, your season's not going very well. The Browns season is not going very well. So Quinshon Judkins, he's the guy that you've been skeptical of late. With Shedeur Sanders starting and just the state of the Browns in this matchup, do you feel any better about Quinshon Judkins here in this matchup?
I can't say that I do. I think this one is sort of just a wait and see. Like I said earlier, like fantasy is so much about probabilities. And I think if you look at this setup and Shedeur being under center there, it's not really an offense that you want to invest in at the moment. Though I will point out that David Njoku a little banged up. If David Njoku were ruled out for this game, then I'd be a little more interested in Harold Fannin Jr. as a potential top 12 option at tight end. But the receiving core, you're crazy if you're playing one of those receivers this week in fantasy with Shedeur Sanders, getting under here for his first start. And we knew this was going to happen at some point. I don't think, we knew it was going to happen this way and unfold this way with Gabriel getting hurt and then Sanders getting thrown out there. But we knew these guys were going to get opportunities because no one right now is the answer in that Browns quarterback room. So they were going to give them both shots, see who could potentially be that long-term backup, and then go out this offseason and try to solve your quarterback situation one way or another. I think that's the plan. So fantasy-wise, reluctantly putting Judkins out there because it's a good matchup, because they're going to have to lean on him. I still think he could come through potentially, but Harold Fannin Jr. would be the only other guy that I'd be considering for fantasy this week in that offense.
And you're probably reluctantly starting Ashton Genty and Brock Bowers. Obviously, Bowers was still good last week, 7 catches for 72 yards. But this is a tough defensive matchup, though. The Browns, look, what's the over-under in this game? It's got to be the lowest of the week. This, I would imagine, is going to be a low-scoring game. So Bowers could certainly still have a good game as long as they use him as the slot. Stop putting him on the perimeter. I don't need to see him running routes against Denzel Ward in this game. I need to see him matching up with linebackers and safeties. Enough of that already. Chip Kelly, though, I can't count on Chip to do anything right. So obviously Bowers and Genty are fantasy starters, but what's your level of, like, how many panic meter emails are we going to get about Ashton Genty after last week's game and then this matchup?
Yeah, I think like looking at Genty and Quinshon Judkins, that was actually one decision that I had in the rankings this week that has been very tough, and I'll probably continue to struggle with it just because the matchup is so much tougher for Ashton Genty in this one. that he really needs to get the receiving work to come through. And they've shown at times they've been willing to give him that. So hopefully that happens in this game here. But yeah, it is not a great spot for him, and a guy who even in good spots has not necessarily come through this season. So it makes me want to push him down further and further in the rankings, even below a guy like Judkins, though I think right now I have him slightly above Judkins. And yeah, Bowers you're playing without a doubt. And then you look at a guy like Trey Tucker, who has had a few good games, but man, this is certainly not the spot that you want to be investing in this offense other than the top guys. So Tucker, just a wide receiver 3 flex and a pretty risky one at that.
Against all odds, we're talking about the Cleveland Browns in Week 12 on a fantasy football podcast. All right, final game here, Falcons at Saints. Outside of Chris Olave and Bijan Robinson, can you make the case? We'll be quick on this game because I think we've talked about Chris Olave enough. But outside of those two guys, do you have anyone else you think is in a good spot in this game?
No. I mean, like, yeah, I just like, you know, even Juwan Johnson, who is even Juwan Johnson, who I would love to make a case for. And I think he could probably still get there with volume, but the matchup with the Falcons is terrible. They are great against fantasy tight ends. So I don't really like this spot for him at all. I don't have a ton of faith in Alvin Kamara, even though he popped up and finally had a good game. I'd like to see him do that again before I start believing that the old Alvin Kamara is back or anything near that. It's just a really awful matchup. This is like the perfect game for this section. With Kirk Cousins out there, people are going to see the name, but Kirk Cousins is not the Kirk Cousins of old. And I think he's such a downgrade from Michael Penix that I am so worried about what this offense is going to look like. Worried even for Bijan Robinson, because with that environment around him kind of crumbling, is he going to be able to continue to put up high-end stats? He'll have to get there on volume and talent. He's not going to get there based on the fact that this offense is going to be in scoring position often, because they're certainly not. Drake London was one of the engines of that offense, and now we're completely taking that away. We're going to have to rely on Darnell Mooney coming through, who has not done it all year long. It's a bad spot, Harmon.
It is a bad spot. Just real quick note on this matchup, because the Falcons are far and away the number one team in terms of single high coverage, according to Fantasy Points data. They play single high on 69.1% of their defensive snaps. The second highest is 64% with the Cleveland Browns. Chris Olave this year, 2.57 yards per route run against single high coverage. And you think about that too with how Tyler Shuck was hitting him on those outside the numbers passes. That's what's going to be available here for him. So definitely another reason to start Chris Olave. Juwan Johnson about 21.6 yards per game against single high though. So that could at least maybe help you if you're trying to start Juwan Johnson in this spot. Okay, we are going to take our last break. When we come back, it's the hurry up offense, rapid fire questions to end the show. We'll get into that right after this. All right, we're back. It's time for the Hurry Up Offenses, where we go rapid fire questions to close out the show. 40 seconds or less. We got to answer these things. We go back and forth. So with that, welcome to the Hurry Up Offense. All right, Boone, get us started. First question of the week.
All right, we've mentioned him far too much in the show, but I have to do it one more time. Producer
Great.
Colin, a diehard Cowboys fan.
Oh.
It made me think on Monday, what would you rather do? You love giving me what would you rathers. I'm sure we'll end on a what would you rather. I'm going to give you one here. Would you rather hang out with producer Colin during a rare Cowboys blowout win like happened on Monday? Or would you rather have to chart the current Raiders wide receiver core for reception perception?
Dude, I already have charted the Raiders wide receivers for reception perception. Jack Besh is in the
What would you rather,
report
though?
right? Oh, I'd rather do that. I would I would easily rather chart the Raiders wide receivers than hang out with Colin. I mean, look, I've hung out. I know I joke about producer Colin. I've hung out with Colin in real life, even away from work. He's a totally acceptable human being. But during a Cowboys blowout win, hell no. I'll get Tyler Lockett's current routes in there, anything. Plus, we can put it on the site. I'll make some money out of it. Give me a break. Okay.
Amazing.
By the way, Colin says his wife would pick the same answer, so that I feel very justified in that. Okay. My first question to you: what is the take you have for the rest of the season that you have no stats or evidence to back up at all, but you just feel it in your bones that this is going to happen?
Even though everyone laughed at him in his first game with this team, I think A.D. Mitchell is going to emerge as the number one receiver for the Jets. And I think A.D. Mitchell is actually going to have like meaningful fantasy performances. We know he can do most of the job. He just needs to be able to finish. I think this guy can still be a really good receiver. And I told you before the season, we did a panel, at the Fantasy Fest there at the Fantasy Expo. And one of the questions was, who's that guy you're going to die on a hill for? It's still A.D. Mitchell for me.
Right,
I'm still dying on that hill. And he has such an opportunity in this offense to do it. So going with A.D. Mitchell. With the trade deadline this week in most fantasy leagues, I want to know, which fantasy analyst is your favorite to trade with? You and I are in a lot of analyst leagues. I'm sure you're in a ton like me. Who is your favorite fantasy analyst to make deals with?
It's easily James Coe from Reception Perception. We obviously work together because he knows all of my takes. I know all of his takes. So I think we know how to best take advantage of the other. And so that I think is the, like, just somebody that knows you really well, I think is the best part. Like,
yeah.
No one's trying to get one over on the other, but it just makes for easy, smooth trades, honestly. The one he offered me recently, I was like, well, I totally understand why you want that and why that works for me. So we actually get the deals done. So that would be.
It's funny that it tends to be the people who you are close with, right? I would say for me it would be Debro, Derek Brown from Fantasy Pros, and yeah, him and I get along quite well.
Oh, there you go. Well, that's perfect. Okay, we'll try to get one more in here before I do another one. What's a trade this year that you made that you regret?
Oh, so many. I traded George Pickens before he got traded to the Cowboys. In a dynasty league, he was still on the Steelers, Pickens and a first to move back into the rookie draft and get Travis Hunter. So that one is one that could cost me a title, even though I still scored the most points in that league so far. Rank these 4 second-round wide receivers with their fantasy potential the rest of the season, or the rest of their careers. Fantasy potential, rest of their careers. Keon Coleman, Jonathan Mingo, Jalen Polk, or Jack Besh. One more time. Keon Coleman, Jonathan Mingo.
Oh, no, I got it.
Jalen Polk.
Jack Besh, number one, far and away. As soon as we get Pete Carroll and Chip Kelly out of there, Jack Besh to the moon, baby. Then I guess I'll go Keon Coleman. Maybe he gets traded somewhere where he's a power slot, I guess, although I'm kind of done with that fanfic. Then I'll go Jalen Polk because I actually kind of liked him a little bit as a prospect. He just was horrible as a rookie. And the Saints do have a wide open depth chart, so you never know. And then like tier gap is Jonathan Mingo. Like, I don't even think he's going to be on a roster next year. So that's my ranking.
It's just me being sad about Keon Coleman and where he's at career-wise right now. All right.
Fair enough. All right, final question. And this one comes in with some help on social media. At Greg Bunch of Numbers sent in this question: to replace me for this segment. For Matt's question of the week, Justin, would you rather ingest a pill every week that makes you 1% dumber, but you don't know or can't prove that it is happening, or finish last in the rankings contest? And I want you to really think about this, man. 1% dumber, pretty decent percent every single week, and you don't know when it's happening. Think about it too. You could get dumber and still finish last in the rankings contest because you're getting dumber as a fantasy ranker.
We've found it. We've found the limit, Harmon. I'm taking last in the contest this time. I am. There's no way. I can't. Like, my brain, the way I think, I have to have that. If I lose that, like you said, I'm going to do terrible in the contest anyway. On top of that, I'm going to lose everything. So I got to go with that. I'm taking last. We have found the limit. Thank you to Greg for writing in on this one. I'm not taking the pill. I'm accepting last in the contest in that one.
You did it. An outrage. I have come up with the most.
Greg was able to do what you could not. Yeah.
And Greg cracked the code because of a make you dumber pill. I'm outraged, but shout out to Greg. It's Greg 892033737. So shout out to Greg for that one. I appreciate it because I actually had no creative juice to come up with a question this week. So shout out to Greg. Incredible. I cannot believe that you picked that. And yet you're like, oh no, I could survive dinosaurs. I can live out at sea forever. Unbelievable. Completely embarrassing stuff. Okay. Boone, hell of a show. This was a packed one. We got a ton of things in here. I'm very much looking forward to that backup running back show. You have no idea how much that conversation gets my juices flowing. So I'm looking forward to that one. We will be back Fantasy Football Live on this channel Sunday morning. John Daigle's Q&A is live on Friday at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. So make sure you do that. This show will be back. Our recap show will be back on Sunday. I believe Chris Allen is back joining with us as well this Sunday. So very excited to have him back. So as soon as Eagles Cowboys hits 000, we're going to be live right here on Sunday on YouTube. So make sure you subscribe so you know when we're going live. Until then, we are out.